I'm really bad at this. No! Alright guys, you can see I cannot do the hula hoop. I'm not using my hips too well, but I somehow still managed to play good tennis. And the reason for that is that you don't need to use your hips in order to produce good tennis strokes. So the topic of the hips and how they're used on the tennis strokes gets a little complex, and we'll go through all the strokes, but let's start off with the forehand. So if you're interested in finding out what part of the body leads the way on the forehand in great detail, check out my kinetic chain video. And what happens on the forehand that the stroke is initiated with the non-dominant arm. That is the first link in the chain. And take a look what happens to my forehand if I lead the stroke with the hip. So in other words, I'm going to initiate the stroke with my right hip, and take a look what happens. What happens when you hit a forehand like this is that you're opening up way too early. You can see that the stroke does not look right, as opposed to starting the stroke with the non-dominant arm and then leading the way in the rotation where the kinetic chain is happening from top to bottom. Take a look. I'm going to initiate the stroke with my non-dominant hand, and then naturally the entire body ends up rotating, going from the top to the bottom. And any forehand at the moment of contact has the right hip for a right-handed player behind the left hip. And this is also the case when the dominant shoulder gets ahead. See, the right hip never gets ahead of the dominant shoulder. There's always the structure at the moment of contact on the forehand. So you can see here that the hip does not lead the way. The non-dominant arm goes first, then the shoulders, and then the hips, and then the legs at the very end. It's the top to bottom kinetic chain. And again, you take a look at any high-level forehand, you will see that the right hip is going to be behind the left hip at the moment of contact, while the dominant shoulder is in front. This is true for the open stance forehand and the closed stance forehand. So what you should do as a recreational player is not think of the hips. The hips will naturally move with the rest of the body. They are somewhere in the middle of the kinetic chain. So if you don't think about it and naturally rotate the body, the hips will be correct. Do not under any circumstance try to initiate the forehand stroke with the hips first. This will result in a rotation that's happening too early, and you will have a very difficult time controlling the ball. So on the backhand, the hips are going to be used differently from the forehand. That has to do with the sequencing of the torso rotation on both the one-handed and the two-handed backhand. Let's start off with the two-hander. So as opposed to the forehand where we're initiating the stroke on top, on the backhand we're going to initiate the stroke on the bottom with the hands close together. And because of this reason, the hips and the shoulders are going to rotate simultaneously into the ball. And this is also true for the one-handed backhand. The one-handed backhand has a separation of the hands that begins in the middle of the body. If you take a look at any high-level one-handed backhand, you will see that the non-dominant hand will come with the racket, and now the separation will start somewhere here. And for this reason, the hips and the shoulders will have to rotate simultaneously. And again, this is not something that you need to worry about, or you don't need to initiate this with your hips and go early here. This will naturally happen as you begin to rotate, and the reason is because the hands are going to be closer to the body and are going to be lower to the body. The difference to the forehand is that because the hands are higher at the initiation of the stroke, is because of this reason we can start the rotation with the non-dominant arm. We cannot do that when the hands are close to the body, and we're also going to be very close to the contact point with very little time. So therefore, the rotation of the hips and the shoulders will have to take place simultaneously. And this is true for both the one-handed backhand and the two-handed backhand. And if you try to do something with your hips this close to the contact, you can very easily ruin your backhand. Let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to try to manipulate my hips and open them up while I hit my backhand, and take a look what happens. So you can see there I completely mistimed the rotation. I opened up way too early. Let me show you another one. I'm going to try to open my hips. You see there I open up too early and therefore lost control of the ball. And it goes the same for the two-handed backhand. Now on the two-hander I'm going to try to open up early with the hips, and let's see what happens. You see that I opened up way too early, I lost my balance and I lost control of the shot. So guys, just like the forehand, do not think of your hips on the backhand. Things will fall into place concerning the hips if you execute the fundamentals correctly. So when it comes to the serve, the topic of the hips gets a little more complicated because we can move the hips this way, but we can also rotate the hips. So let's first talk about the rotation of the hips. And it's going to be very similar to the forehand. So the rotation of the hips on the flat and the slice serve. Keep in mind that the rotation in general is going to be limited on the kicker. So on the flat and the slice, the rotation of the hips will never be initiated prior to the elbow. So the first thing that happens on a flat and a slice serve, once the racket drops, is the elbow will come out. And now from here, the body will continue to rotate, eventually going to a position where the right shoulder is aligned with the left shoulder. And if you take a look at my right hip, you will see that the right hip will never get ahead of the left hip while the shoulders are parallel to each other in relation to the baseline. So what that means is that the rotation is executed top to bottom, very similar on the forehand. It starts with the elbow and then naturally the rest of the body will rotate, eventually with the legs turning and going like this. And guys, do not under any circumstance start to initiate your serve with the hip. This is going to be an absolute disaster. Take a look if I try to start the rotation with my hips. Actually, I think I pulled something in my back. That was dangerous. Do not do this, guys. You can see how terrible it looks. Let me show you one more time. I'm going to try to initiate the rotation with my hip. Oh my goodness. Yeah, this now I pulled something on the right side. I got two pulled muscles in the back. Okay, let me try now a regular serve. You tell me which one looks better. So guys, do not worry about the rotation of your hips on the serve. Naturally, the hips will rotate with the rest of the body if you execute the fundamentals correctly. So when it comes to going forward with the hip on the serve, this is something that you do see from high-level players, and it's something that is an option to you, and I'm going to explain what the purpose of it is. But first, let's talk about what happens in the loading position of the serve. So when the serve is fully loaded, we're going to have our racket here in the trophy phase. Our non-dominant arm is going to be vertical to the ground. We're going to be on our toes. We're going to have our knees bent. We're also going to have our chest up to the sky. This is going to depend on your flexibility. And now, if you take a look at what happens to the serve once we toss the ball in front of the baseline, we're going to lean forward. Now, if you lean forward without getting the hip out, you're going to lose your balance very quickly. And what happens to the body, if we get our non-dominant hip inside the court, at the same time lean forward, this is going to provide our body with a lot more balance. And you got to push the hip into the court up to your comfort level. There's even some professional level players that do it too much. So they severely go into the court like this. Now the body is bent in a very unnatural way. You got to remember that when the body is bent in this way, there are no biomechanical reasons why you should get more power from this. There's absolutely no power straightening the body from here to here, because we're only working here with the side muscles of the abs, and we really don't have a lot of strength on the side of our body. So do not go past your comfort zone when you're pushing the hip into the court. Personally, I like doing it a little bit to gain balance as I'm leaning in, and it feels much better than being straight like this and leaning in. So I do recommend it to players that want to improve their balance while they're leaning forward, but be very careful not to overdo it, because you will not be able to come out of a position that's too extreme like this. Remember that a lot of power on the serve comes from bending the body backwards, because as the body straightens, now we're using very strong muscle groups, mainly the abdomen and the lower chest area, to straighten the body. So this is a far better way to load the serve, bending it this way rather than this way. Now, some players like Sampers will do it both. So they will slightly have the hip into the court and they will also bend backwards. And this does feel quite comfortable. But if you take a closer look at Sampers' serve, you will see that he doesn't have that extreme pushing out of the hip. It's just slightly inside to give the body a little bit more balance as it's leaning in, but he has a severe back bend of the body, and he's going to be able to generate a lot of thrusting power as he accelerates upwards into the serve. So guys, I'm not saying don't use your hips. I think it's good to use the hips in general. It can help with your flexibility, and it's going to help you to become an overall better athlete. And I'm sure I can benefit from learning how to hula hoop. However, if you try to use your hips to improve your stroke, a lot of players think they're going to get more power from using the hips. The opposite is going to happen. You're going to make your strokes worse, your timing is going to suffer, and you're going to lose control. And the far better thing to do is to not think of the hips at all. When it comes to the rotation of the hips on our ground strokes, or even the rotation of the hips on the serve, trying to initiate these strokes with the hips will not only make your stroke worse, but it can possibly lead to injury. This is not something that you should try to attempt to do. Instead, don't think of your hips at all. Apart from that little tip that I gave you on the serve where you can push your hips slightly into the court, the hips will naturally be in the correct position if you execute the fundamentals correctly.